and today she will be speaking about the dangers of Stoicism. Very provocative title. So once again, please type your questions into the chat. You'll remain on mute, and let us know if you can't see Sarah's screen. And yeah, keep yourself on mute and we'll have question times towards the end. Thank you, Sarah. Feel free to take it away.
Hi guys, everyone can see the screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, firstly I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking. This is an Iowan country, always has been, always will be, and express my respect to traditional custodians and elders past, present and emerging, and also to extend that respect to those elders and custodians of the land on which you're sitting today. I should also say that I am going to talk about self-killing at the end of this presentation, so just a heads up. Now, I'm aware that this event is designed for people who are enthusiastic about the potential of Stoicism as a philosophy and a way of life in the modern world. It might then seem pretty perverse to take as my topic the dangers of Stoicism. However, what I'm going to try to convey today is that I'm not in any way diminishing the value of Stoicism, quite the reverse, but trying to indicate a way in which I think it's easy to misinterpret Stoicism in terms of its lessons for daily life and the world in general. Now, all of you here will know that when we talk about Stoicism, we don't mean the stiff upper lip brand of emotional disengagement associated with British public schools. But the comment I'm about to show you certainly is in line with many modern understandings of Stoicism, and it's not really a million miles away from that rock-steady upper lip. Okay, so unconventionally, I want to first look at the source for this comment. You'll note that this comes from an academic article. Now, it's not written by people who specialise in ancient Stoicism, as the range of thought systems covered by the article suggests, but it is a representation of one of the strongest afterlives of ancient Stoicism in the modern world, the absorption of the philosophy into modern psychology, and particularly into cognitive behavioural therapy, a move that began with Beck's work in the 1970s and continued on with Ellis, Burns and others. So now let's look at the quote. The colloquial saying, "It is what it is," reflects the Stoic insight that we frustrate ourselves unnecessarily by disagreeing with nature and resisting the flow of experience rather than surrendering to it. Confession time. I absolutely hate the saying, "It is what it is." Yes, it's an innocuous saying, and to my mind, that's half the problem. It strikes me as defeatist, bland, lazy, the moral equivalent of watching reruns of Friends because you don't have the energy to start watching something new or turn the television off. It is what it is smacks to me of a kind of passive fatalism that sees individuals putting up with terrible conditions, bad treatment, and unhealthy relationships rather than fighting to improve their situation. In this particular context, the authors are using the quote to encapsulate an aspect of ancient Stoicism that's been particularly influential in a modern psychological context. This is the idea most powerfully expressed by Epictetus that men are disturbed not by things, but by the views that they take of them. That is, events in the world are generally neutral, or in Stoic terminology, indifferent. What makes a difference is the way that we choose to react to them. In most cases, most people react incorrectly. We read things as bad, such as illness, physical pain, death, and failure, which are indifferent. Likewise, we incorrectly categorize things such as success, health, life, love, mango Pepsi Max as good. These things too are strictly indifferent. Now, the observant Stoic should read only virtue as good and only vice as bad. Any other aspect of life or occurrence should be treated with the rational detachment reserved for things that just don't matter. Much later in the world of cognitive behavioural therapy, Ellis developed this into 3 irrational beliefs. This is from the book, How to Make Yourself Happy and Remarkably Not Disturbable. Ellis thought that there were three essential irrational beliefs which were the source of most cognitive dysfunction. 1, I must be successful. 2, others must treat me well. 3, the conditions under which I live must be agreeable to me. Now, Ellis suggested that cognitive health could be achieved by replacing must with I would prefer that. So this is closer to the variation in Stoicism that allowed for preferred and non-preferred indifference. So some forms of Stoicism, and certainly cynicism, would have written off all three of these beliefs as truly irrational. Your personal success, all of these things, the comfort in your life, how you're treated by others, they are what they are. Neutral, detached observation would show you that it's ridiculous to even class them as preferred. I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. But in contrast to this kind of attitude, some of you might have recognized a personal hero of mine on the opening slide of this talk. Now, as we discussed yesterday, I might not look it, but I'm a very keen runner. I cover about 70 Ks a week, although I don't compete. And as I mentioned yesterday, when David was talking about running a Stoic practice, I'm definitely at the obsessive end of the spectrum. Now, this is one of the famous images of Kathrine Switzer running the Boston Marathon in 1967. At this time, that was strictly against the rules. You can see the race official, Jock Semple, behind her trying to tear off her race number and physically remove her from the course. Her male colleagues, in particular her partner and later husband, stepped in to protect her from these repeated assaults and so allowed her to finish the race. As a consequence, Kathrine Switzer became the first woman to successfully complete an official marathon. And she was, to quote an interview she did with The Guardian in 2018, disqualified and expelled from the Athletics Federation because I had run with men, because I had run more than 1.5 miles, because I had fraudulently entered the race, which wasn't true, and the worst one was because I had run without a chaperone. Also, as a consequence, there was a steady movement towards the official admission of women to marathon racing, culminating with the inclusion of the women's marathon in the Olympic program for the first time in 1984. Indeed, by 2019, the data showed for the first time that there are now more women than men running competitively worldwide. Kathrine Switzer's insistence on officially competing as an equal in the Boston Marathon, despite repeated attempts by that race official to manhandle her off the track, her insistence on must, not I prefer that, stands in complete opposition to the fatalism of it is what it is. Switzer was determined to succeed. She was determined that others would treat her well, in this case as an equal, and she was determined to live under conditions that suited her beliefs. By following her personal determination in this way, she changed the rules, and in a moderate way, she changed the world. Now, I think most people, possibly not those women in the last 10 kilometres of a particularly brutal race, would consider what Kathrine Switzer did as a positive action with positive consequences. My question today is, does this act really stand in opposition to the tenets of ancient Stoicism, so casually encapsulated in some views in the modern world by the phrase, it is what it is? Part of the problem in answering this question is that this vision of Stoicism, a cultivated calm indifference to events one cannot change, is only one part of the shape of ancient Stoicism, which, as we all know, looks simple, but reveals itself and is more and more knotty the closer you look. Firstly, absolutely central to the philosophy is the role of virtue, the only good thing. What do we mean by virtue? Well, this is a nice statement from Seneca the Younger in his philosophy course by correspondence in the Epistolae Morales. We have separated this perfect virtue into its several parts. The desires had to be reined in, fear to be suppressed, proper actions to be arranged, debts to be paid. We therefore included temperantia, fortitudo, prudentia, and justitia, assigning to each quality its special function. Many of you will recognize here the 4 cardinal virtues, a set of ideas that predate Stoicism but took a central place in their way of thinking. Now, an enormous amount can be written and said about exactly what these terms mean. Cicero devotes much of his work, De Officiis, to explaining and building on Panaetius's understanding of the cardinal virtues. But today I'm just going to give you a quick and dirty definition of each. So temperantia is self-control, prudentia, wisdom, fortitudo, courage, and justitia, justice. To take the last first, justitia means giving to each their due, giving to each person what they deserve. If we look at Catherine's actions, focusing in on her resistance to the race marshal, then we could read them in at least 2 ways. We could read this as an example of her failing to pay respect to an official of the course who had a job to do, backed by all the regulations of the National Athletics Association. We could also suggest that the man's actions rendered him unworthy of respect, and so Catherine was just in giving him the lack of respect that he deserved. On the other hand, was she acting to ensure that women had their due, and so, whatever her reaction to the marshal, acting in the interests of wider justice? Likewise with temperantia. Should Catherine have shown self-control by reining in her desire to race? Or could we speak of her intensive training schedule for the event as evidence of her great self-control? Now, fortitudo might look straightforward. The woman ran 42 kilometers while under periodic physical attack. But here we need to consider Cicero's comment that fortitudo is the only one of the virtues that is not necessarily a virtue on its own, but must be teamed with one of the others to qualify. His suggestion is that prudentia is an ideal companion for bravery, and here our situation is no clearer. Catherine could be accused of a lack of wisdom in that she was predictably banned from athletics as a result of her actions. She could be praised for her wisdom for the change that she helped to set in motion. The answer is, it's complicated. And this means that we need more information from the Stoics to assess our case study. So let's zero in on the essential idea of virtue once again. The cardinal virtues are one way of assessing this, but we can look at it through another lens. The Stoics believed that to live virtuously was to live in accordance with nature. Another nicely vague statement. And the nature of a human being is to be rational. This is the key difference that separates humans from animals, according to most Stoics. By nature, we have ratio, reason, and the obligation to live our lives according to it. So here, in the words of Epictetus, for what is a man? The answer is a rational and mortal being. Then by the rational faculty, from whom are we separated? From wild beasts, and from what others? From sheep and like animals. Take care then to do nothing like a wild beast, but if you do, you lost the character of a man. You have not fulfilled your promise. Of course, this means we must use our reason to establish what our place in the world actually is, and to accept that place and fill it as best we can. Returning to Catherine Switzer, it's worth noting that, according to received wisdom in the 1960s, women's bodies were not capable of racing long distance. And long distance pretty much included, wait for it, anything over 800 meters. Even if a woman showed herself capable of running a longer distance, there was a belief that this was unnatural for women's bodies and so would do long-term damage. According to the understanding at the time, it was an act against nature for a woman to compete in or even to run a marathon. Here we meet with a serious complication in terms of abiding by Stoic thinking. Nature isn't a fixed point. Our understanding of what is in accordance with nature changes continually. Nowadays, there is even some scientific evidence to suggest that women are better suited than men for ultra-long distance running. What Catherine did actually helped to change our understanding of what nature for humans means in the context of sustained physical exertion. So the question of living in accordance with nature is certainly complex. Cicero in De Officiis, helpfully or unhelpfully, depending on your point of view, further breaks down the question of living in accordance with nature into two main aspects. We must realize that we are invested by nature with two characters, as it were. One of these is universal, arising from the fact of our being all alike, endowed with reason, and with that superiority which lifts us above the brute. From this, all morality and propriety are derived, and upon it depends the rational method of ascertaining our duty. The other character is the one that is assigned to individuals in particular. Everybody must resolutely hold fast to his own peculiar gifts, insofar as they are peculiar only and not vicious. For we must so act as not to oppose the universal laws of human nature, but while safeguarding those, to follow the bent of our own particular nature. And even if other careers would be better and nobler, we may still regulate our own pursuits by the standards of our own nature. So this second character is all about what is specific to you as an individual, your physical characteristics, your personality, even down to whether you've got a sense of humor or not, your particular talents. This means that a life in accordance with nature is a life that is lived also in close recognition of your own personal gifts and tendencies, so long as those are not actually vicious. Given this, we could argue that Catherine Switzer was absolutely acting in accordance with nature, in that she recognized she possessed the physical and mental ability to compete in a marathon, and she followed through. Of course, this too raises contradictions and difficulties. Catherine's obedience to her personal nature led her to act in a way that was understood as being against nature generally. What's a good Stoic to do? Was this a case where a Stoic would have decided that it was not within their power to change the situation, and so should simply have altered their attitude towards it? After all, it was a long time between Catherine's defiant act and the institution of the women's marathon and the Olympic Games. The initial consequences of her actions may well have made it look as though it was simply the result, that it might simply result in serious personal consequences, and that was it. Now, Catherine Switzer doesn't claim to be Stoic. My question is simply whether Stoicism is a thought system that would support or condemn her actions, and this, to my mind, speaks to this essential issue of passivity. Is Stoicism a philosophy that encourages one to be passive, to simply accept unfair situations on the grounds that it is your reaction rather than the situation that is unreasonable, as the is what it is doctrine might suggest? We can put this question in another way. Would the Stoics of the Greek and Roman world have recognised a fellow in Catherine Switzer, or would they have condemned her on philosophical grounds? I think it would be unfair to use a full-time philosopher as a point of comparison, like Epictetus, but we handily have another Stoic who is very much involved in the world, and that is Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger. Not just a Stoic, but according to Roman Stoicism, perhaps the closest thing that they would ever see to a Stoic sapiens, or perfect wise man in the flesh. Beyond philosophical context, Cato, despite a reasonably limited political career, was a figure of enormous moral authority at Rome. There's a story I love about this. There was a festival at Rome called the Floralia, and the Floralia involved a series of theatrical events which culminated with the actresses being brought forward to the front of the stage. At this point, the audience would all yell out, "Take your clothes off." And the actresses would take their clothes off and everyone would have a lovely time. Now, it happened that Cato the Younger was attending the Floralia one day. Got to the end of the show, actresses come to the front of the stage, and dead silence. Really intensely awkward silence. And after a while, Cato looks at his mate and says, "What's going on?" And he's like, "It's you, Cato. No one is willing to ask for the actresses to be stripped naked in front of you." Cato's like, "Oh, sorry," and leaves the theatre and everyone can continue to play. Cato, in moral terms, is like everybody's dad at Rome, okay, in the best possible sense. Now, in Stoic circles, Cato is probably most famous for his death, as Miriam Griffin so elegantly showed in the 1980s. Cato's self-killing, voluntaria mors, or voluntary death, became a template for activism in the Roman imperial period. In a move endorsed as far back as Zeno, Cato chose to remove himself from life when he regarded it as impossible to live a good life any longer. Unlike Zeno, who quite mysteriously decides that it's time to leave life when he falls over and breaks his toe and reads this as a sign from the gods, Cato's death was powerfully and effectively political. Cato had fought with the senatorial forces led by Pompey the Great in a civil war against Julius Caesar, when Caesar had illegally crossed the river Rubicon with his army and marched on Rome. After the disastrous Battle of Pharsalia, Pompey, the leader of the senatorial forces, fled to Egypt, and Cato was left in command of the remaining troops. After marching with his men through Africa to Utica, he realized that Caesar's position was unbeatable, ordered his men to surrender and ask for mercy, something that Caesar famously loved to give his defeated enemies, and chose to end his own life. He's sometimes called Cato Uticensis as a result. Now, Cato's messy, determined self-killing was designed to signal loudly to the Roman world that it was impossible for Cato, moral standard of the Roman elite, to live in a world ruled by Julius Caesar. He refused to sanction Caesar's right to extend mercy to him, and instead told the world at large that Cato would rather die at his own hands than accept Julius Caesar's right to rule and to offer mercy. This was a devastating political technique. Julius Caesar, we are told, was absolutely furious, and he organized for his followers to write anti-Cato pamphlets to try to break down Cato's degree of moral exemplarity. And they contain details like, he drinks too much, he doesn't wear any underwear, you can find him in the gutters, like showing that he doesn't wear any underwear, completely drunk. This technique was unsuccessful. In fact, his followers and supporters in response wrote pro-Cato pamphlets, and his legend grew. If we squinted a little, we could read this in some ways as an endorsement of the is what it is philosophy. Cato understood that he did not have the power to change the situation, and so decided to control his attitude towards the situation in a very final fashion. But this is not the message that we receive by looking at Cato's death in the context of his life. We're told by Roman authors that Cato, from his earliest years, was a figure who specialised in resistance against seemingly impossible odds. Now, the earliest story is one that relates to the social war, that is, the conflict with the allies, the Socii, where Rome fought against the Italians when the Italians, tired of fighting Rome's war for them without any right to vote, fought for citizenship. During this conflict, Cato, as a child, was staying at his uncle's house, and his uncle had a connection with one of the Italian leaders, Quintus Poppaedius Silo. Poppaedius was in town at the time, pushing for support amongst the Roman elite. This was 91 BCE. He happened, on an upper story of the house, to run into Cato and his cousin, children at the time. And he said to the kids, "Come on, boys, you'd support the Italians for citizenship, wouldn't you? Yeah." Cato's cousin immediately said, "Absolutely, I support the Italians for citizenship." And little Cato said, "No, under no terms." Poppaedius gets a bit sterner and a little bit more threatening, and he says, "Come on now, child, you'd support the Italians for citizenship, wouldn't you?" Little Cato, "No." At which point Poppaedius picked him up and dangled him out of an upper story window. And he said to him, "If you do not say you would support the Italians for citizenship, I'm going to drop you." And little Cato still refused to give in. Now, whether or not this event was historical, it gives you a sense of how Cato was seen. He would have been 4 years old at the time. So this was a situation where Cato was theoretically at his weakest, a 4-year-old child against an adult, dangled out a window. Still, he embodied resistance. This resistance became more and more active over time. There are many stories about this, but there's one that stands out. In 59 BCE, during the first consulship of Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar blatantly and illegally misused his powers as consul. Every consul at Rome was appointed with a colleague, with the idea that no one person would hold power. Julius Caesar was appointed with a man called Bibulus. Bibulus disapproved of many of Julius Caesar's ideas, and so used his power as a consul to see bad omens every morning. He'd look out the window, see a bad omen, and declare that no public business could take place that day. Julius Caesar ignored him and went ahead with his consulship, passing all kinds of legislation with a degree of threatening intimidation involved. This was so remarkable that instead of referring it to the consulship of Bibulus and Caesar, as was the Roman convention, Romans often referred to it as the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Now, at one point, Julius Caesar put forward a land redistribution law, according to some sources, or in some other versions, a law in favour of the publicani, the tax collectors. Now, land redistribution is always very controversial. It was in the ancient world and it is in the modern world. Cato was a political conservative and totally opposed to the idea of land redistribution, as well as to Caesar's outrageous abuse of power. Could he, should he, as a Stoic, have focused on adjusting his own attitude? Consuls, after all, even consuls behaving legally, have great power in the city of Rome. And at this point, there were no checks and balances in action. Cato possibly should have regarded this political question as something which was, after all, indifferent, not essentially about virtue. Instead, Cato decided to filibuster in the Senate House to block the passage of the law. Caesar was furious. This is a bit of a theme in their relationship. And he commanded the lictors, his armed bodyguards, to drag Cato out of the Senate and take him to prison. So what happened next? This is a version from Valerius Maximus. Admiration of his great and genuine life also made Marcus Porcius Cato so worthy of veneration by the Senate that when Cato was spinning out the day by speaking in the Senate House against the publicani under an unsympathetic Gaius Caesar as consul and was led away to prison by the lictor on this account at the order of Caesar, the entire Senate did not hesitate to follow him. This turn of events dented the determination of the divine mind, by which Valerius means Julius Caesar, who's been made a god by this point. According to Plutarch's account, Cato kept filibustering even while he was being dragged out of the Senate House. He would not shut up. In both versions, the Senate follow him out and Caesar is forced to concede. This is a consistent pattern in Cato's life. A refusal to cede to circumstances, a refusal to adjust his attitude instead of attempting to change events, working towards the good of the community and virtue as he saw it. Now, we might not agree with Cato politically in all cases. I very rarely agree with Cato politically, but we can appreciate the sheer determination of his stance. This was not a man who was prepared to calm himself down, practice detachment, and accept that events were beyond his control. Even his death was a deliberate, pointed action in pursuit of change. So it's a slightly grisly image coming up. This is one of the many paintings of Cato's self-killing, this one in the 17th century by Giambattista Langhetti, and you can see that he is holding himself upright, still talking, even while he's making sure he dies. So Cato's death, we are told, was designed like a stage set, a dramatic scene played out, complete with ostentatious rereadings of Plato's Phaedo and declarations of his self-determination prior to his death. Now, I would argue that this is a side of Stoicism that's often elided in the contemporary approaches to the philosophy as a way of life, influenced in many cases by the way in which the philosophy has been adopted by CBT. We tend to look to Stoicism as a means of letting go of the beliefs that are so often spurs to action and to change, as a means of accepting our reality and living with it despite its discomforts. However, While the Stoics would certainly frame appropriate spurs to action without reference to emotion, they would certainly not advise acceptance in all cases. This is a thinking philosophy, a philosophy that treasures rationality and humans' intellectual capacity. This is a philosophy that challenges you to think through your actions and to decide what nature, virtue, and the human community demand of you. Justice is one of the cardinal virtues for a reason. Cosmopolitanism, the idea of the rationality of every individual, citizenship of a community so much wider than your own, means a responsibility to a community much wider than your own. I would argue that Catherine Switzer, rationally deciding to demonstrate her ability as a woman to officially run the Boston Marathon, could do so in an entirely legitimate fashion within the tenets of Stoicism. And by doing so, she would be living in accordance with nature, for the good of humankind, in pursuit of virtue. Stoicism never presents an opportunity to stop thinking, to stop asking oneself uncomfortable questions and to rely on platitudes. As Will mentioned yesterday, in the aftermath of Cato's dramatic life and death, it became a philosophy of political resistance at Rome, and one focused on challenging absolute power and enacting seemingly impossible things. This strikes me as a particularly important thing to remember when the current world contains so much that can tempt us to disengage, to detach, to stop reading the news and focus instead on our own inner tranquility. Yet a Stoic who lives in accordance with reason has every reason to fight, to stand up, to speak out, and to persist, even against odds that seem to be overwhelming, even against political climates that seem ludicrous or unreal. There is, I would contest, absolutely no reason for a Stoic to accept that the injustice in this world is simply what it is, because it doesn't have to be what it is. Thank you.